Thank you for joining this webinar. I try to share the screen. And is it all visible for you now?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. We talked a lot about the potential of multi-species swards in our project R4D, and we visited several farms dealing with this in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, but also here in Germany, and from one of our pilot farms, which is the Lindhof, the experimental farm for organic farming. I will give you some insights in the potential of multi-species swards for eco-efficient dairy production in northern Germany. I just have to, hopefully I can, I can't, how do I do? Yes, and that's just to give you an insight who's talking to you and where from. The Lindhof is in the northern part of Schleswig-Holstein, the northern part of Germany, very close to the Danish border and very close to the Baltic Sea. Lindhof is a farm which has a comparable way of keeping dairy cows, which is comparable to those which you know from Ireland. It is pasture-based, but in contrast to Ireland, pasture is not permanent grasslands. It's more or less all multi-species swards. And in another webinar, I talked about the project there, eco-efficient dairy production, and one part of the story is the multi-species swards. Why being interested in herbs and other legumes, or even the multi-species swards, increasing biodiversity is a topic for modern farming. We can do it by adding these plants also with benefits for flower visiting insects. Several studies have shown it. We see in several studies positive impacts on animal performance. And of course, for forage, it's always good if it tastes good. And it is reported that if animals can choose free, they will take up quite a few herbs and legumes. And when they take a lot of these plants in, a high forage uptake is, of course, very important for dairy production. These plants have high especially. And what's interesting, and what we all learned in other webinars, was that there are also phytotherapeutic value in some herbal forage plants. Because of tannin contents, there may be antihelminthic effects, and also the content of tannins may prevent of bloat, which is very important in grazing systems. These secondary plant components like tannins, and in some cases so-called polyphenol oxidases, increase ruminant protein utilization, and tannins can decrease methane emissions. The formation of methane is depressed by tannins. And what's very important in our debate of climate change, farmers are not only contributing in some extent to the climatic change, but they are also victims of the climatic change. Increasing temperatures, prolonged periods of drought make it more difficult to produce forage. So some herbs and legumes are deep rooting and can increase the water use and plant nutrient use efficiency, and can positively contribute to soil fertility. Multi-species mixtures, I have one of those we have on our experimental farm, can increase yield or at least reduce the production risk in years with extreme weather events in plant species with complete, especially when they have complementary functional characteristics such as different root depths and different nutrient uptake ability and a complementary leaf structure. And when they are combined with each other's, the utilization of the plant growth factors can be optimized. And if you look at our typical swards containing of chicory on the left side, perennial ryegrass, and Lotus corniculatus, birdfoot trefoil, and then red clover, plantain, and here salad burnet and caraway. You can see different root types and different leaf structures. But what secondary legumes can be seen as alternatives to white clover under our Northwest European conditions, and possibly could be integrated into mixtures? Of course, we all know the white clover, with its very high potential for grazing and low fiber content and very high energy content, but it is shallow rooted and suffers often to drought. Then, of course, it's good to have some deep rooted legumes, like, for example, the red clover or the alfalfa, and sainfoin and birdsfoot trefoil, or, for example, the hybrid clover. But often these plants contain additional secondary compounds, like, for example, the red clover does with the polyphenol oxidases, which stabilizes the protein content and avoids that it is degraded in the rumen. Alfalfa has a very high quality fiber, and sainfoin and birdsfoot trefoil, they have very high contents of tannins that may have antihelminthic effects that can prevent us for bloat, and the high content of tannins stabilizes the proteins. Hybrid clover is interesting because it copes very well on wet and clayey soils, so it also has its place in multi-species swards. There are, of course, some other species like the black medic or the sweet clover or ceradella that have additional characteristics, but they are of minor importance, but we also can talk about them later in the discussion. With respect to protein quality, protein stability, we know that species like the white clover and the alfalfa, as well as the perennial ryegrass, is free of tannins, or nearly free of tannins. Some white clover flowers might have some small contents of tannins, and their crude protein is very fast degraded in the rumen, and it is not stable. But when looking at the red clover, we already see a very stable protein, very high contents of undegradable dietary protein, and this is caused by an enzyme called polyphenol oxidases, which is in red clover and which is very important for efficient feeding. And as I said, birds for trefoil and sainfoin, they have also very, very stable protein, and this is due to high tannin contents. And for comparison, all these three species come very quite close with respect to the UDP content to soya meal, which has also a very quite stable protein. There are quite a lot of studies that compared multi-species swards and the integration of, for example, birds for trefoil or the sainfoin into seed mixtures. Often we see, like here it is marked in red, higher live weight gains when these species are integrated. But of course, we have to differ if it is just an addition of protein, because these are protein plants rich in protein, or if it is the secondary plant metabolites. To illustrate the anti-helminthic effects, we can see a picture here of some interintestinal parasites. Above, this is the control. Everything is smooth with this parasite. And when a lot of sainfoin is fed, you can see that the tannins react with the surface. And this is more or less the reason why there are effects and why there are less interintestinal parasites when you feed crops like sainfoin or other tannin, other crops rich in tannins. But of course, multi-species swards also often contain herbs, and there's quite a big variety of interesting herbs. Most known are, of course, chicory and Lancelot plantain. I will come later to them, but other species like sheep's burnet, even the dandelion, which for some conventional farmers is even seen as a pain because it's not that productive, may have positive impacts. And quite a few multi-species seed mixtures contain caraway and yarrow. There are, of course, these secondary metabolites that are interesting. The sheep's burnet has a very high content of secondary plant compounds, polyphenols, that makes the protein stable. These polyphenols can also seen in a line of tannins. It is known that when you feed dandelions at a certain percentage of below 10%, we have positive effects on milk yields. And caraway is rich in ethereal oils and has positive effects on digestions, and it works antibacterial. And the same is with the Lancelot plantain, high contents of secondary plant compounds, and it works anti-inflammatory. And the same does the yarrow. But of course, it is very important that these herbs, on the one hand, taste good and that they are productive. In some seed mixtures, there are also meadow sage, chervil, or parsley. but seen from the perspective of this talk, unfortunately, due to poor emergence after seeding, I can't tell too much positive stories about these last three, but we have very good experience with sheep's burnet, chicory, caraway, and the lanceolate plantain. But what is it when you ask a cow, would she eat it? Of course, when harvested as silage and mixed and chopped, there is no selection, but there have been ongoing trials, for example, at the University of Kassel in Germany, where they exposed cows that can have a free choice to plots of, for example, bird's foot trefoil, plantain, chicory, sheep burnet, and yarrow. All these 5 species are marked in color because they had also been part of our multi-species mixtures, and compared them to other herbs, like, for example, the mugwort or sage or even marshmallows. And what the colleagues recorded was number of bites. They really liked to eat the birdfoot trefoil, the plantain, and the chicory, where they really ate a lot, while they ignored other plants there. And I will come back to this when I show you some results of our own feeding trials. So there are some species what the cows really like. And we here at the University at Kiel, we're working since 2005 very intensive with the potential of herbs as secondary and secondary legumes at our research farm Lindhof. As you can see, it's very close to the Baltic Sea. It has an average yearly rainfall of 780 millimeters, evenly spread over the years, but we can tell that also drought periods are increasing, for example, especially this summer, but also 2018. We have moderate temperature and are located on sandy loamy soils. First, we started with pure swards before we then combined them in mixtures. In the central pictures, you can see a pure sward of chicory, and on the left side of this picture, a pure sward of bird's foot trefoil. And when it comes to the species I have introduced, we can group them on the left side in the group of legumes, in the more right middle part in the group of herbs, and we compare parameters like forage quality to grass. And when we talk about grass under our conditions, it is always the perennial ryegrass, which is a very high productive, but also a grass with very high forage quality. And when we look in a more or less system which is 4 times defoliated per year, we can see that some herbs like the sheep burnet, caraway, and yarrow, and the dandelion can show higher energy content than the grass. But the main use species like chicory and plantain, they will not reach the energy concentrations of the perennial ryegrass. But this is to say in advance, this is because 3 or 4 times is a too low intensity for use for these plants, because they are really fast getting mature and generative, and then forage quality decreases. Compared to grass, legumes have lower contents of metabolizable energy, But when it comes to the point of crude protein contents, then it's clear the very strong part of the legumes, except of sainfoin, is very high crude protein contents. And when there is not fertilized additional nitrogen fertilizer, there is not much difference between herbs and the perennial ryegrass. But other interesting compounds are the minerals. And here you really can see that nearly all species have higher calcium contents than the perennial ryegrass. And especially the deep-rooting chicory, the sheep's burnet or salad burnet is the same plant, and plantain, because also of their deep roots, have very high contents of calcium. And also the legumes are known to supply cows with high contents of calcium, which is positive in the most part of the year. Of course, we have to be careful when we want to dry our cows off. And with phosphorus, when it comes to the point that we in future might also will have difficulties to have enough phosphorus, it's interesting to see that some herbal forage plants are able to acquire a lot of phosphorus from the soil, like chicory, plantain, and caraway, but just as to mention this. And when it comes to the secondary compounds like tannins or polyphenols, I talked about that from our species, that Lolium corniculatus, the bird's foot trefoil, and the sainfoin have very, very high contents. But when it comes to a species like the yarrow, and especially the salad burnet, we also can find very high contents, the same in chicory and plantain, much higher than in Lolium perenne, which is the perennial ryegrass. But now let's talk about yields and quality of multi-species swards. That is when we have combined them to one sward and compare it to a standard grass clover. And let's see what yields and quality can achieved by these swards. In the next slides, we are comparing a grass clover here in factor 2, consisting of perennial ryegrass, red clover, and white clover, with 2.2, a grass clover, which also contains the herbs, as I mentioned, bird's foot trefoil, caraway, salad burnet, chicory, and lancelot plantain. We carried out this experiment over 4 years and had 3 different defoliation intensities. Here in this trial, it is still without grazing, but in the next experiment, I will also tell you what our grazing animals do. But here is more or less how often they are used. When we use these swards, this could be also been done in zero grazing system, when you are cutting fresh forage for feeding. Some can call it also simulated grazing. It is harvested as often as the swards can be grazed, but the material is removed every 3rd or 4th week, or compared to a 4-cut system when there is between 4 and 7 weeks between the cuts. And when it comes to dry matter yields, we summed them up to tons of dry matter. And here we have the systems that are cut every third week, in the middle every fourth week, and in a 4-cut system. Of course, when you harvest more often, you have longer periods with not full leaf area, and that may decrease dry matter yield. But what we can see is that in all systems, there is achieved higher yields when we added herbs and bird's foot trefoil seed mixture 2, which is the right-hand column of this. So there is advantages for this multi-species swards, but this is not always present in every year. And when I show you the next slide, I can show you the same swards in a normal year, a relative dry year, and as well a relative dry year. As long as a typical grass clover has enough water available, the multi-species swards had no positive impacts on yields. But as soon as there were longer dry periods, then the deep rooting plants like herbs and the birdfoot trefoil had positive impacts on the yields. And when we look at a typical growth curve and see that a typical grass clover is the black line, and the gray line is the multi-species swards, we can see on average similar yields in the first part when there is not much drought, but when it's getting drier, there is the grass clover plus herbs multi-species swards at some yield stability. And when I show you the same growth curves in 3 years that had quite dry periods, you can see that the addition of herbal forage plants gives some more yield stability. Sorry, I had only 2 dry years, 2015 and 16. Unfortunately, this experiment stopped in 2018, but in normal years, there's not much effect on yields. But let's see what we can see when our swards of multi-species with multi-species are grazed. Here I have integrated 3 different sward types like I did before. They are 4 different yield parameters we have to look at, but it's always consisting of 3 columns, where always the left one symbolizes a grass and white clover sward, which is very typical for grazing. In the middle, there is a grass white clover sward where we added the red clover, and then the right one, we took the multi-species sward and looked at how much grass there was on offer for the grazing animals in 2016, when it was a quite dry year. Seed mixtures containing deep-rooted plants reached higher yields than those where there were no deep-rooting plants integrated. But of course, the red clover here under grazing conditions, and the slides before it was under cutting conditions, produced more biomass. So deep-rooting plants help with yield stability. And when we then expose these swards to grazing, get the cows on, and in a rotational grazing system, take the cows off after 1 day, grazed the swards 9 times per year. Of course, there is some biomass left, around 20% during the year. And then we can see that the multi-species swards were as good grazed as the grass and white clover swards, the swards with a lot of red clover in it, but they were also higher yielding, had some higher grazing residuals. But when it comes to the net grazing yields, which is the difference, which is then the uptake of the swards, we can see also under grazing conditions very higher utilizable plant material when we use the multi-species swards. And when we look at these swards, I will illustrate you by this plot experiment where we derive these data from cows where could free choice between different plots, and cows have been 1 day on it. And what you can see in here in the front and also in the background were very much high productive swards, and there had been swards that were more or less ignored by the grazing animals, and even tracks were ignored. And when you can see, it is perennial ryegrass that was ignored by the animals. And when you look what it was, then you can see that these swards here totally grazed were multi-species mixtures, and the very high quality perennial ryegrass were ignored by the cows, while in other countries that is the most valuable forage plant. So this says something about what cows would eat when they have the free choice. And when it then comes to this, of course, there is selective grazing. We can see here it is the energy concentration, the net energy concentration, which we use in Germany. Unfortunately, I don't have this in metabolizable energy, but 1 megajoule of net energy lactation is equal to 1.6 megajoules metabolizable energy, and 6.7 megajoules net energy lactation is equivalent to 11 megajoules ME. Here you can see that the swards grass clover with herbs in the middle has an as good as net energy concentration before grazing like the grass and white clover. And grass, white clover and red clover had a lower energy concentration. And when then the cows select, you could see that our cows selected mainly the herbs and the clovers but left the grass over. And when you can see that through this selection, the cows intake had a much higher energy concentration than there was offered, and the grass clover with herbs was as good as the grass white clover. So it's definitely an alternative. And the same is, of course, with the N concentration or the crude protein content. Our swards with the grass, clover with the herbs had an as good as protein concentration before grazing as the grass white clover, and the concentration in the forage which was eaten, it was up concentrated, and it was as good as of the grass and white clover. So this shows a little bit about the potential. Two small but maybe very important studies. Somebody has maybe realized that we here at our in our experimental farm, we're also focusing on methane emissions. There are different techniques to measure it. With the so-called SF6 method, it's possible to measure methane emissions also on grazing animals. And when it is that some of the species contain tannins, we asked ourselves, will there be a difference between methane emissions of ryegrass white clover swards and multi-species forage swards? So we exposed our cows in groups of 15 animals in 2 different periods to both a binary mixture consisting of white clover and perennial ryegrass, or multi-species mixture containing also the red clover, the birdfoot trefoil, caraway, plantain, and chicory, and measured both in blue the produced milk and the methane emission per kilogram of milk, and of course forage quality. With respect to forage quality, I have to tell again that the energy concentration of the binary swards without the herbs was higher than the diverse swards, but only a tiny little different. Very high energy contents have been reached. The same is in the first period, which was in May and in August, and organic matter digestibility was a tiny bit higher in the binary mixtures compared to the diverse mixtures. But interestingly, the cows loved the more diverse mixtures, and the dry matter intake from these swards was in both periods higher when we let them graze the multi-species mixtures. And that led to one point, that the cows produced a higher amount of milk in both periods when they grazed the diverse mixtures, even if the same amount of biomass was offered. This is a good thing, but we could not show what we desired, that there had been differences, that the tannin contents could decrease the methane emissions, and that must be because the the organic matter digestibility of the diverse swards was lower. But this is not really a bad thing, because when you compare these values to other studies, this fresh and young forage reached very, very low methane emissions per kilogram of energy corrected milk. And when it's compared to other studies, these swards, which are optimal in energy concentration, produced very low methane emissions. So it doesn't matter at this level that the multi-species swards did not affect this so much, because it's on a such low level, and these results have also been found in a comparison study of Wageningen University, which showed that grazing very energy-rich grass compared to silage feeding at the same energy concentration decreased methane emissions. So this is just to show you what we mean when we think about eco-efficiency. We just can tell that our multi-species swards performed very good without higher emissions. And some other studies, but I won't get into it. We looked also at the abundance of flower visiting insects, of bumblebees. And here we could show that species-enriched grass clover mixtures promoted the bumblebee abundance compared to intensively managed conventional pastures. We can talk about it in the discussion. And the last one is we also published from our studies, I have shown you with the methane emissions, that we also analyzed the milk for the contents of milk fatty acids. And it was recorded that there were much higher concentrations of the valuable omega-3 fatty acids when we grazed multi-species swards compared to less diverse swards, of course, on a very high level. And that's what I wanted to explain to you. So our multi-species swards with the secondary legumes and herbs increased biodiversity, decreased the risk of drought with respect to dry matter production. It reduces our need for mineral supplementation. We can see and saw an increase of forage uptake, and we found no reduction of yields. And of course, tiny amounts of less extent of forage quality, but it could not be shown by the animals. The animals, they liked it and had this even higher uptake from the multi-species swards. Deep rooting did a very good job under our performance, and we now add red clover, chicory, plantain, and bird's foot trefoil to our grass and white clover species swards. If this is difficult, our first experiments where we established them as pure swards showed that one also can establish these herbs as pure sown strips when the concurrence of the old sward might be too high. And on our permanent grassland and some of our pilot farmers, what they do is when they are in spring harrowing their permanent grassland, they are at the same time oversowing also with this deep rooting and valuable species like red clover, chicory, and plantain. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. That's all I have to tell.
Thank you very much, Ralf. Are there any questions? Then raise your hand or write it in chat as you prefer. Seems that everything was clear.
Or too much.
Or too much.
Yeah, okay. Sometimes.
No, it was okay. Oh, George is typing.
Okay.
George asks if you would recommend MSS for Irish dairy farmers.
It's difficult. George, you have been there at Lindhof and seen it. We're doing more or less lay farming, and then it is completely easy to do it. It is quite difficult when you anyhow are reseeding your swards quite often, as there may be often happening in Ireland. I heard about every 5th year. Then of course you can include it. I would say plantain and chicory could be good, and try with the red clover. You know, our grazing intensity is quite high like yours. And for us, it is surprising how the red clover does there. It can't persist a 5 or 6 cut system, but 10 times grazing, no problems for the red clover. So it is an idea when we do have to solve some problems like reduction of nitrogen fertilizers input or biodiversity aspects. You should you should try. You have seen it. Yes and no. The thing is, you asked. We plow them up because we have them integrated in a mixed farming system. Typically, the swards will last 3 years, and for us, the red clover is a kind of starting culture. It is more fast than the white clover. We always have the white clover within the swards, and when then the red clover is decreasing, which has to be the motor because of its high inputs of nitrogen, then the white clover takes over, but it helps.
Okay, seems to be clear for George.
Thank you.
Some other questions? Well, if not, then yes. Thank you very much, Ralf, for your interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for everyone who joined this webinar. As I already said, I will publish it on our website, so you can watch it again or diffuse it to your colleagues.
Thank you for your interest. Of course, just respect with George and how long they last. These herbal forage plants, it is that the chicory does not last that long, but there are some varieties that can, but the plantain that lasts a long time. But thank you for your interest and have a nice day.
Yes, from my side also. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Okay, see you then.